Episode 9 on Overcoming Imposter Syndrome at Work with Lisa Orbé-Austin. Welcome to Brave by Design. I'm your host, Laura Khalil. I'm an entrepreneur, coach, and speaker. I love thinking big, exploring the power of personal development, and sharing the best strategies from thought leaders and pioneers in business to empower ambitious women and allies to bravely rise and thrive. Let's get started. Hi, friends. Welcome to Brave by Design. It is me, your host, Laura Khalil. I have a great discussion on today's episode with Lisa Orbé-Austin, where we talk all about the very surprising ways in which your workplace may be promoting or aggravating your imposter syndrome. It's just fascinating. I really love this discussion. You're going to get so much value out of it. So stay tuned for that. A couple of things I want to mention before we get to the show. First, I want to give a huge shout out to all of the folks who have gone on Apple Podcasts and given this show 5 stars. As you know, we have been alive, so to speak, as a podcast for about 2.5 months. That's not a long time. But because of your listenership, this show is in the top 90th percentile of new shows. Isn't that exciting? So I want to give a shout out and read a couple of these amazing reviews we've received. This one, so on point, by Audra Rowley. She writes, I had the pleasure of listening to Laura speak at an event last year about imposter syndrome. Since then, I have been a follower of her work, and this podcast is just the latest of her great contributions. I was hooked on the first episode. Finally, a podcast that incorporates all the challenges of being a professional woman living and working in a white, heteronormative, patriarchal society. She uses laughter along with serious analysis in her podcasts, making it fun and easy to listen to. The topics are so on point, and her guests offer great expertise and insight. I feel like I found my tribe, and I'm looking forward to more episodes. Oh my God, Audra! Oh, gonna cry. So sweet. And this other review we received from AB Perspective, she writes, get ready to take notes and do the work. Laura is a powerhouse. She shares such thoughtful and empowering advice through this podcast and her Facebook community. She hosts a variety of guests, and each person brings great knowledge and perspective to the table. Thank you for being intentional, direct, and real, Laura. Next step is up to us. Do the work. Ain't that the truth, girlfriend? I know who AB Perspective is. She has been active in our Facebook group, and it is really a great place for people to get breakthroughs, okay? So if you're not in the Facebook group, what on earth are you waiting for? Every Tuesday, our episodes come out. Every Wednesday at noon Eastern, I host a live after show talking about the episode, talking about my impressions, and it's also a chance for you to engage with me. It's how I really want to give back to the community. It's also where I talk about our inspired action of the week and give you that to do if you choose to take it on. So let me talk about this week's inspired action of the week. I want to start by saying, yes, it is weird to read reviews of yourself out loud. Okay, so I just want to acknowledge that is a little bit weird. But this week, our inspired action is about bragging. And I know someone just heard me say that and they're like, oh my God, she did not just say that. I did. And here's the reason why. I want to talk to you about something I posted actually on LinkedIn the other day about this, because a lot of people have this notion or idea about staying humble. And if you are one of these people, I would like to tell you or suggest that the people who need to stay humble are not the people who say they need to stay humble. It's kind of like with imposter syndrome, as you're going to learn on this episode. The people who suffer from imposter syndrome are not the actual imposters. Okay, so let me explain a little bit more about what I mean by bragging, what I mean by not staying humble, because I know that can kind of feel like a jarring thing to hear. Okay, here's what I wrote on LinkedIn. And if you're not following me on LinkedIn, jump on over there. I'll put a link in the show notes. I said, please ask yourself how you're of any use to anyone if you hide your gifts from us by quote unquote staying humble. No one is suggesting you become a cocky jerk, but I am suggesting you get as comfortable talking about your strengths as you are pointing out your weaknesses. Do you feel me on this, guys? Because most of the people who talk about staying humble are the folks who are really suffering from imposter syndrome. This is a beautiful segue in today's episode. How many of you are so quick to say, oh, I'm not good at that, or oh, no, I could never do that. I'm not good enough. I'm not ready. I don't have enough experience. I don't have enough clients under my belt. I don't have enough years, whatever it may be. And you are so quick to diminish or minimize any of your strengths. So when I talk about bragging, I'm not talking about making things up, half-truths, things that are false. I'm just saying this week, your inspired action, if you so choose to take it, is to let people know about the strengths you have and the accomplishments you have made in a factual manner as a counterpoint to us always being so quick to point out our weaknesses. When you can become as comfortable talking about your strengths as you are pointing out your weaknesses, then you're a balanced individual. No problem. Okay, that's actually humility. Is saying, hey, I have some good stuff and I got some lousy stuff. Okay, but only pointing out the bad stuff. First of all, why would anyone want to work with you? If you are always minimizing yourself, I don't trust you. I don't think you can do the job. I'm afraid you can't. I might need to micromanage you. I might need to look over your shoulder. Second of all, I believe that every single individual on this planet is either born with or learns innate talents and gifts along the way. And if you are hiding your gifts from us by staying humble, you are doing nobody a favor. Okay? It's actually one of the most selfish things you can do, believe it or not. All right, so that's the inspired action. Head on over to the Brave by Design Facebook group. We're going to talk more about it this week. And without further ado, let's get on to this week's episode with Lisa Orbé-Austin. Everyone, I am so excited on this episode to talk all about imposter syndrome with our amazing guest. I found her on LinkedIn and I have not stopped following her stuff. Her name is Dr. Lisa Orbé-Austin. She is a licensed psychologist and executive coach with a focus on career advancement, leadership development, and job transitions. She is a co-founder and partner of Dynamic Transitions Psychological Consulting, a career and executive coaching consultancy where she works mostly with high potential managers and executives. She earned her doctorate in counseling psychology from Columbia University Teachers College. Her views about career advancement, job transitions, leadership, and diversity and inclusion are regularly sought by the media, and she has appeared in outlets such as the New York Times, NBC News, Forbes, Huffington Post, Refinery 29, Business Insider, and Insight into Diversity. Holy shit. Her book, Own Your Greatness, Overcome Imposter Syndrome, Beat Self-Doubt, and Succeed in Life, being published by Ulysses Press and co-authored with her partner, Dr. Richard Orbé-Austin, will be released in April 2020. Oh my gosh, Dr. Lisa!
Hi, Laura. How are you? That was awesome.
Well, I'm so excited to have you here. As I started off by saying, I've been following your stuff on LinkedIn, and I was just like totally blown away by what you were posting. And I knew we had to have you on this show because people are, they think that people like you and I don't have imposter syndrome. And I think that's really funny.
Yep.
It's like, well, actually, guys. And so I wanted to, well, first of all, I wanted to ask you, let's define what is imposter syndrome?
Sure. So imposter syndrome is the experience often felt by people who have, are highly successful, have achievements, have successes, have credentials, but they constantly feel like they're a fraud, that they got all those things either from overworking, from the benevolence of some other person or by mistake or luck. And so they constantly overwork to show that they are not a fraud. Any mistake that they make is oftentimes feels like evidence of their fraudulence, and can be so that's why they sort of protect against making mistakes, because that's sort of a revelation. It feels like it's a revelation to others that they are a fraud. So this sort of prevalent feeling of that they're fraudulent, that they're incompetent, that they're truly undeserving of all the success and achievements that sort of pervades their life.
What I find so fascinating about imposter syndrome is that the people who often suffer from it are not the imposters.
It's the paradox in it. Yes.
Right. You're the opposite of an imposter.
Right. Yes, exactly. It's funny because sometimes when people ask me about the book, initially they don't understand the concept of imposter syndrome. They're like, "Oh, so you write about those people who like the Catch Me If You Can guy that has like a million identities?" And I'm like, "No, it's exactly the opposite of that."
It's you or I or anyone who's ever felt like, I often equate imposter syndrome if you've ever met someone who said, "Oh, I just got lucky," or, "It wouldn't have happened without so-and-so." And it's kind of like you're minimizing yourself.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
Moments. So I really want to ask you, I know that a lot of imposter syndrome begins in childhood. And as I was preparing for this episode, I was thinking about my own imposter syndrome and some of the places where that started. And I know I was a very high performing, classically trained flutist. A lot of
Oh,
people don't
wow.
know that. And so, yeah, I grew up playing the flute and I was very gifted at it. I'm not ashamed to say that. And
That's
I
awesome.
ascended very quickly through, middle school and high school and all that stuff, and did all the competitions and traveling and whatever. But when you have to always feel like you have to be at the top,
Yeah.
and you can never show any weakness, and you
Yeah.
have to be the best.
Yep.
I know that that is one of the things that you talk about, where the seeds of imposter syndrome begin to land, because you don't feel like the best. There's people better than you.
Right.
There's people worse than you. And,
Yep.
that's just kind of how the cookie crumbles. But can you talk a little bit about some of these seeds of where imposter syndrome starts to get planted in us?
Sure. And I think what the piece that you're referring to there is this underlying kind of perfectionism that often exists for people who who have imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Is this constant need to feel perfect, especially in an experience like being a flautist, like that, it's about precision, about perfection, about representing the piece in a very particular way. Like making mistakes isn't seen as like appropriate to advancement, or that it's going to help you out.
You can't mess up.
No, you can't, because then probably it's brought to your attention.
Right.
It's not like, oh, great, you're going to give you even better next time. So I think especially like that perfectionistic tendency underlies a lot of imposter syndrome. But one of the things we talk about oftentimes is that in research, there's typically we found two developmental patterns. And then my husband and I, when we were writing the book, thought about a third pattern that really isn't talked a lot about in the research. But the first two patterns that exist in early childhood is, one, you were seen as the smart one, or the capable one, or the skilled one, whatever it is that was the particular domain where you feel the imposter syndrome, that you were considered like naturally gifted. And as a result of being naturally gifted, the idea is that people who are naturally gifted don't have to work. It just comes easy to them.
Right.
So that's one of the underlying early childhood experiences. The other one is that you were considered the one who works hard. So you weren't naturally gifted. You weren't considered naturally talented or naturally intelligent. You were considered like, you get to where you get because you know how to work hard. And what's interesting clearly about those two perspectives is you're probably both at all times, but people have very hard times being able to understand that you can be naturally talented and still need to work hard. That those things that they typically go together. That they are not mutually exclusive, although we often perceive them as such. And the third type is, which is not talked a lot about in the research literature, but I think we've seen it a lot in our practice, is people who've had to survive. So people who weren't like thought of as either the naturally gifted one or the one who works hard, but they didn't really have a lot of adult support or adult kind of voices around them. They just had to survive. So they learned how to kind of be successful in order to kind of make it. And so they don't perceive themselves in either one of those lights. They just know how to survive. And that their survival often depended on how excellent they were at certain things. And so it didn't feel like a moment of like praise and heralding how great you are. Just as like, okay, I got to the next place, I'm going to be okay. And if they did make a mistake, often it could be catastrophic because they had very little support underneath them.
Wow. And so continuing into adulthood, they still feel, even if they are managers,
Yeah,
directors at any
executive
level.
C-suite. I've seen it in all these kinds of places. Yes, that they can have been had multiple C-suite roles and still feel like if I make one mistake, it's going to all fall apart, even though clearly that's not even remotely possible.
So for folks who are experiencing imposter syndrome, and also let's talk about one thing quickly.
Mhm.
Uh I think a lot of people think imposter syndrome happens primarily to women, but I don't think that's entirely what the research shows. Can you tell us, does it happen for both men and women?
Yes. And the research shows a lot of it's not been consistent. So in some places it showed women have it more, in some places they showed it's mixed. But I think it gets confused that, the only people that have it are women is because this started with the evaluation and the research of women. So two psychologists named Clance and Imes discovered this kind of phenomenon in the 1970s, working in a college primarily with women. And so they initially thought it only existed with women, but they're seeing it equally both in men and women. They sometimes say that it can show up a little differently in men than it does in women, so maybe that's why initially it wasn't sort of
Mm.
seen. I think what the research finds is that men sometimes find themselves, rather than reaching to the next echelon, they they will they prefer competence and mastery, so they will stay at one or two rungs below where they probably should be in order to kind of feel like they are kind of mastering the situation. And that where women take greater risks, and will put themselves out there even if they are constantly plagued by the feeling of fraudulence.
That is really fascinating. And so one thing I want to ask you, because this is it's such a juicy topic, and it's such a topic that I think people are afraid to sort of confront and deal with.
Yeah.
I want to know, can you tell us, why is this so important to you? How did this research become the thing that you really wanted to, put a stake in the ground on and look into?
Because I had it myself, and because it kind of overcoming it changed my life. And so I'll tell you like the moments that sort of shifted for me. So I was probably a couple years out of my PhD program, and I had been plagued with imposter syndrome throughout my entire probably educational career period, but definitely in graduate school when I was, classmates with people who went to Harvard and Berkeley, and it just felt like I didn't belong here, that it had been some mistake that I had been admitted, and I always felt like eventually they were going to find out.
Mm, that
And even
feeling of finding out, like you're
yeah,
going to get caught.
yep. And even when I graduated, I would still feel like I would get a call from like Columbia, and it would be like one of these like fundraising calls, and I would think that when I listened to the voicemail that they were going to say, "Oh, we found a mistake in your dissertation, and we're going to have to rescind your PhD." I would fear it like
Wow.
constantly, probably for the first couple of years, and as a result, I was in this really awful job. That had nothing to do with my doctorate. I had just fallen into it. I wasn't sort of directing my own career. And I had this really awful boss, and he was sort of taking advantage of. He inherently probably knew, like unconsciously, that I had imposter syndrome, and he was just taking advantage of it. So he drove me really hard. He was constantly withholding of praise. He
Wow.
would embarrass me very publicly, usually shaming
Oh
me for
my
something I didn't
gosh.
do or like wasn't capable of understanding. He was very like publicly humiliating, and I took it for like a good like 6 or 8 months. And then I was and I had been talking to my husband like, I gotta leave this job, and he was like, leave, 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 and I just couldn't leave. I felt so stuck.
Oh,
And then I was in a meeting of all the senior leaders of the team. They were all women, and there was music playing in the background in his office. And somebody asked, what is this music that's playing? And he said, it's music to soothe the savage breast.
what?
And And in that one moment, I was like, I can't do this to myself anymore. Like, I am now participating in him, like, referring to me as a beast, in essence, a
That is
beast of breast, right?
outrageous.
Yeah. And so I sat through the meeting, and as soon as I got out of that meeting, I stormed into my office. I called my husband. I was like, I'm going to quit, like, immediately. He was like, quit. So I packed up my office that weekend. And on Monday, I brought my keys. I walked in with just my keys. I cleaned my computer and everything. And I went to his office and I said, I'm quitting. No notice, no nothing.
Mm-hmm.
That was it. And at first he like cried and got emotional and was like, you can't do this to me. The money for your salary is encumbered, which in grant terms means that you can't use it for anything else.
Oh,
And I was like,
tough
I don't,
luck, buddy.
yeah, exactly. I was like, I don't care. And then when he realized I wasn't budging, then he started to threaten me. And he said, like, you'll never work in education again. You do this and you can forget about your reputation. So it's like all the fears of
Wow.
imposter syndrome
Popping up,
come
everything
alive.
popping up.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I still did it. And like, I walked out of that office and I went home. I don't even remember the period of like leaving his office and going home. It just like, I blacked out, I think. And then I went home and had like a panic attack. Was like, what was I thinking? And so, but it changed my life, because in that point, my husband was like, okay, take this energy and do something for yourself. He said to me a line that I will never forget and has become the mantra of what I do, which is that if you can take, if you can work the way you work for others for yourself, you're going to be unstoppable. And he's like,
Wow.
take all that energy that you put into other people and their evaluation and put it toward yourself and develop the practice. And that was the beginning of our practice. I took that period right after to do the administrative work for the practice, to study for my licensing exam, to do all these things for myself I had put on hold, and started the practice in the fall of that year. That was in spring. It was in the fall of that year. It just changed my life. And as a result, I have this amazing practice that I love that gets to save imposters every day. It's just this gift, and it came
Lisa,
from dealing with my imposter
that's
syndrome.
incredible. That is incredible. And it's funny. I have like shivers hearing that. And I hope that our audience really heard that, because you felt stuck and
Yeah.
trapped. And so I want to transition to an article that you recently wrote that really talks more about that. This article, The Imposter Syndrome Triggering Workplace. Guys, if you're listening to this, find Lisa on LinkedIn, and I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes. In this article, you say, while your imposter syndrome can be triggered by a high profile assignment or a new accomplishment, particular work environments can serve as a breeding ground for imposter syndrome, and these workplaces can feel very difficult to leave. You continue and say, sometimes it's not the entire workplace culture, but a boss who draws you in to feeling a heightened sense of fraudulence. And I'd love for you to share with the audience, what does that manager look like? For people who are listening, what do they need to be looking for? How may that appear to them?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things a lot of people say with imposter syndrome is it's got me to where I've been. It's what's made me successful. And with a decent, good boss, you can kind of succeed, because you're just always working so hard. You're working like the amount of more than one person. But I think with with one of these imposter triggering kind of bosses or in work environments, they sense this in you. They sense the insecurity. They sense the need for validation. They sense that you're going to work far beyond what anyone else is capable of in order to prove yourself, and they use it. So they use it to kind of like, and they don't give you consistent positive feedback. They'll give you positive feedback once in a very blue moon, but most of it is kind of critical. They tend to kind of sometimes, be the kind of withholding boss that doesn't give much but expects a lot, and you feel like you constantly need to prove yourself
Mm.
to. They have very poor boundaries between personal and work life, that they want you to, in essence, devote most of your energy towards your work life. They're just very capable of manipulating the imposter syndrome. So I think a lot of the research talks about our own individual responsibility in dealing with imposter syndrome, and I truly believe that. Our book is largely about how do you deal with this yourself, but I also believe that a lot of this gets exacerbated by certain workplace contexts that we've come to think are normal but are completely unhealthy, and that are some way priming the development or the exacerbation of the imposter syndrome.
And the managers, do you think they know what they're doing?
I think some of them do, and I think some of them don't. Like, I think it's a large unconscious process for them. Like they just know that, they're not happy with your work product and that you're not working, they just are kind of like, they just think this is just normal, I think, managerial behavior to motivate you, but it's
Mm,
completely unhealthy and they often benefit from it. So when you're working like for two people, they're getting an extra person on their team and not having to pay for it. So
right.
they're benefiting from the way that your imposter syndrome functions. And I think a piece of them is keyed into that. Because you're usually not the only one, who's also struggling with this in their system, because they know how to hire, recruit this kind of person.
Who just is over the top with
Yeah.
a hard worker, probably type A,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
going.
Perfectionistic, high achiever. Yeah. Like the kind of person when you ask them, like, what is your weakness? And they say, I'm a workaholic. Like that's the thing that they
Right.
love,
You're hired.
You're hired. Exactly.
You're on the team. Yeah. And so this, it's kind of funny because when I hear you talking about this, I just wonder if these managers also really suffer from imposter syndrome.
It's
Like,
possible.
like if they also feel that they need to work so hard and they blur work life boundaries,
Hmm.
because they always feel like they're not catching up. Who knows?
Yeah, it's
Um,
possible. Totally. And
so
it's a good thing to remember, right? Because you can accidentally then also perpetrate, your imposter syndrome on your direct reports if you're not conscious of the way that you work, right? Because the other thing about imposter syndrome is that, because you're perfectionistic, when you have reports, like direct reports, oftentimes you like are concerned about their performance because it reflects on you. So oftentimes you micromanage them, you get involved in ways that aren't helpful for their development. So you can also turn this on someone else. So you do want to be conscious of how it's playing.
mm. Now, if I have a manager who I sense has some poor boundaries or is more interested in providing critical feedback instead of constructive feedback, or kind of knows what those triggers are to, get me going, so to speak. What can the employee do in that situation? What would you recommend?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that I think is the easiest to do is to start to kind of gain back your power. So kind of like what my husband said about sort of taking that effort that you're putting towards the work and kind of putting it towards yourself,
Mm.
and start to really work on the foundational layers of caring for yourself. So like bring back boundaries at work, like have a regular leave time, like, don't answer call if you can, don't answer calls outside of work. Like start to become more unavailable, start to have things that you book after work so that you can't stay later, you can't do more. Start to really take care of yourself, because what happens with imposter syndrome is you're depleting yourself so much that you need the external validation. You don't even know how to internally validate yourself. And so you've got to work on sort of taking care of yourself so you can begin to care about how exhausted you are and how drained you are and filling your tank. So I think that's, so for me, very, very fundamental. I mean, I think you can think about sort of how much like play or room do you have to kind of alter the situation. In some cases, like with my boss, he was very, very powerful and he had no interest in changing. I had given him, I didn't tell this part of the story, but I actually had found out at one point that my counterpart was making 50% more than me. And I had
Stop.
yeah, and I confronted him on it. And he was like, oh, well, I'll try to do the best I can. In 2 weeks, I'll give you a pay raise. And he never did. So I was trying to make interventions and he just wasn't responding to me. And so in those cases, like I'm a very big believer in, like, in this particular work environment where, organizations aren't necessarily loyal to you. You're not going to get the gold watch at the end
Right.
of 40 years anymore. Use your autonomy to test your value in the marketplace. Like think about what other options you have. You could often make more money switching to another role, somewhere else. This time you're going to look very carefully at what kind of manager you're going to get. And you're going to evaluate that, not just be happy to have a job, but really take the power in your own hands to think about what you can do, what changes you can make. Start with yourself and caring for yourself.
You said something there that I really just want to touch on. You said, you talked about we can develop sort of an addiction, so to speak, to this external affirmation or praise because we
Yeah.
can't give it to ourselves, and it creates like this vicious cycle
Yeah.
where you're craving it
Yep.
from this person who really is never going to give it to you in a way that you need it.
Yep.
And you can only give that to yourself.
Yeah. Yep. And I think that's that's the most dangerous piece of, I think, imposter syndrome, is that this could if you don't stop it, no accolade is ever going to stop it for you. Like, I mean, I'm telling a story and I had an Ivy League PhD and I still couldn't like get rid of it, right? You have to
Right.
decide you want to change it, because no credential, no validation is ever going to stop it. You have to stop it. Because this could just be a cycle that you do forever throughout your entire work life. It's very toxic. In essence, it's just attempting to drain you of everything you got. So it leads to kind of things like burnout and, feeling like, you lose your direction in your own career because you just don't have enough energy to care.
Hmm.
And you just let things happen.
And again, all going back to, maybe this is just how you learn to survive. Maybe because you
Yeah.
were told you were naturally gifted, or maybe because you were the one who always had to work hard to get anything.
Yep.
And so you just get into this cycle. So, guys, listening to this, think about those cycles. Also, pick up Dr. Lisa's book, because I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of research in there, and tools that people can adopt
Yeah.
and begin to use.
The book is a workbook, actually. It's meant to actually take you through the steps to get over your imposter syndrome. It's like a 9-step process to kind of getting through imposter syndrome. It's like the things that we do with our clients, the things that are found in research, the things that we did and that I did to get out of it. So it's the
OMG.
process. Yeah.
Love it. Okay, so here's one thing I want to ask you.
Mhm.
We talked a lot about these types of managers. Now let's talk a little bit about, okay, you're ready to level up. Maybe you have identified that this manager, it's just not working out. Maybe the environment is supporting it. How do we look for, and what are these signs of a toxic workplace? Let's say we're considering interviewing for a role. What can we look for to say, okay, that might be a red flag?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think some of those things are, I mean, you're going to ask, I'm going to encourage my clients and encourage other people to ask things like, so what's your managerial style? How do you work in developing your direct reports? Like, I want to hear sort of somebody's philosophy on how they manage and how they work with their direct reports. If I don't hear a lot of stuff around their development, if I don't hear a lot of intentionality about developing direct reports, I'm a little concerned. Because I really want a manager who really thinks about that. Like, when I work with managers, I'm encouraging them to learn how to develop a developmental plan for their direct reports. So it's really important that they have some consciousness about the fact that their job is not to just extract work from workers,
Right.
but that they're here to also develop people over time, career wise. I mean, I think I'm also looking for levels of toxicity in the interview process and dynamic itself. So it just, does this person like, is this person kind of being super cold to me and I can't read them? And I think, oh, it's just because that's their style. Well, if that's their style interviewing, likely it's their also style managing. And for someone with imposter syndrome, people you can't read are not useful for you. You need people who communicate very openly, who are very clear, who are clear with their own boundaries, but are just not like, just feeling manipulative in that process. So I don't necessarily enjoy hearing from clients and other people that they couldn't read somebody, that they were confusing, that they were sort of harsh in the interview. That's to me not a good sign early on, that a manager is going to be a good developmental manager. I also look for like boundary violations in the course of the interview, like people who let people come in and out of the interview process. They're going to get on a phone call in the middle of your interview, like disrespectful and toxic
Hmm.
behaviors that you see that you kind of blow off because their lives are busy. Don't blow those things off. They're typically signs.
Right.
Uh,
And what I hear you saying, Dr. Lisa, is remember that you guys are equal partners in this interview process.
yes.
You're interviewing them
Yep.
and they're interviewing you, and this has got to be a good fit.
Yep. Yes, and I think that's such an important piece for people with imposter syndrome, because oftentimes we're just grateful to get an opportunity. We're happy to be in the room. Like, you've got to kind of shift that mindset. It's got to be like, no, I deserve to be here. I have an opportunity here, but you also need to kind of, you know, I'm not saying this in the, I'm kind of being a little facetious, but they've got to woo you a little bit too. They've got to make it an exciting opportunity for you too, not a one-sided opportunity. And because that's a bit of a sign, right? You should
Yeah.
be happy to be here. Um,
Absolutely. I also want to say to the audience, if you're interviewing and that company doesn't have a plan in place for how employees move through the organization or advance, like they don't
yep.
do any form of leveling or they don't do any form of career advancement that's formalized within the company, one,
Yes.
ask about that. And
Mm-hmm.
2, if they don't have it, be concerned,
Yep.
because you probably are going to be a worker bee
Yep.
and be driven into the ground. And then, you get exhausted and move on to the next. It's like I'm telling my own personal story here. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, um,
Completely agree.
I want to encourage our audience. One, go back and listen to, I think it's episode uh, 3 or 4 on traits of a great manager, because we do talk a lot about what to look for in that manager. And I'm just thinking about that right now.
Mhm.
And I think that would be a great compliment if you're listening to this episode. Dr. Lisa, do you have a final piece of advice for folks on how to manage their own imposter syndrome or overcome it?
I guess the greatest piece of advice I can give you is like, don't just let it ride. Like, do something about it, make a change, and start with yourself. Start with nurturing and caring for yourself and starting to create some personal boundary with work. Really, this is about sort of your long-term commitment to your own development professionally. And so, like, it can be changed, and it can be changed fairly quickly if you're super committed to it. But commit to yourself, because like my husband said, like, if you work as hard for yourself as you do for others, like, you truly can be unstoppable. I mean, it's absolutely the case.
I love that. And Dr. Lisa, how can people stay in touch with you and find out more about the book?
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn. You can follow me on LinkedIn. I also have a pretty active Instagram. So it's Dr. Orbé-Austin. So Orbé-Austin. I'm pretty active there. Like, if I'm speaking anywhere, I'm putting it up there. I'm talking about the book and stuff like that. So that's
I
probably
love
where they
that.
can
And we
find me.
will
And
put
I have a
all the
website.
links. Yes, we'll put all the links in the show notes.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for being with us today. This
You're
has been
so
such
welcome.
a rich discussion. I loved it.
My pleasure.
Thank you. I want to thank you for joining me, and remember to subscribe through your favorite app so you can stay up to date. And I would love your review. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a review and comment on Apple Podcasts. You can also keep in touch with me online. You can find me on LinkedIn, and I'm also on Instagram at Force of Badassery. All that information will be available in the show notes. Until next time, stay brave.